So for my video presentation, I chose to do Falkland Islands, which are also known as Malvinas Islands. They're a group of small islands in South America, about 300 miles away from Argentina. They are a territory of the United Kingdom. They're self-governing. They have a capital called Stanley, where two-thirds of their population live. And the history behind Falkland Islands is actually kind of interesting because there's a lot of dispute behind who owns it. So in 1764, the French were the first ones to start a settlement on what's now known as East Falkland. Then the British settled in West Falkland in 1765, but the Spanish ended up driving them off after the Spanish bought out the French settlement. After Britain threatened war, they were able to reclaim the settlement in 1771, but 3 years later they ended up leaving it because of economic reasons, although they never renounced their claim on the islands. Spain, on the other hand, had a settlement until 1811. So a few years after Buenos Aires declared independence from Spain, they also declared sovereignty on Falkland Islands. What happened with that was there were 3 U.S. warships near the islands that ended up being arrested. So in response, the U.S. ended up destroying the Argentine settlement on East Falkland in 1831. Then the last remaining Argentine officials were removed by the British force in 1833. Then by 1841, they appointed a governor, a British civilian lieutenant governor. And then it wasn't long until more British people started showing up. They became a self-supporting community, and the entire community was established on the islands. Then after World War II, the issue of Falkland Islands sovereignty was passed on to the UN because Argentina was still claiming that they should own the islands. They were citing the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was when Spain and Portugal divided the New World between themselves. And because Argentina had succeeded from Spain, they felt that Falkland Islands should also succeed from European rule. And then they also thought that because it was close to South America, Argentina should be able to own them. Britain claimed that their occupancy in Falkland Islands wasn't actually colonial or anything, and if the UN were to pass the ownership to Argentina, it would create a worse situation because the islanders who were living there during the time after World War II did not want to be under Argentinian rule. So the UN invited Britain and Argentina to discuss the sovereignty over Falkland Islands, and this was back in 1965. Some almost 20 years later, they were still discussing it, and they didn't come to a resolution about it. So on April 2nd, 1982, Argentina actually invaded Falkland Islands. So this started the Falk Islands War, which actually didn't last very long. It only lasted 10 weeks, and Argentine forces ended up surrendering to the British forces who occupied the islands. So in the 1990s, Britain and Argentina, they patched up their relations, but the topic of Falkland Islands was still very controversial between them. It would start a lot of arguments because Argentina still feels like they should have sovereignty over it. But in 2013, the islanders voted unanimously to continue being a British territory. So that's their history. The main religion of Falkland Islanders is Christianity. There's also a few other religions that are followed because of the immigrants that are there. This includes like Islam and Buddhism. The cuisine eaten there It's very British. They like things like mutton, lambs. They also eat a lot of their fish that they catch, or squid, the seafood for when they go fishing. They also love tea. In fact, they have a break they call a smoko, which is basically just tea time. It's usually mid-morning, so that's part of their culture. They also like coffee, and then they have something called hot toddies, which is rum and hot water mixed with some sugar, which is considered a staple in the Falkland Islands. For dessert, they'll have something like scones, cakes, and meringues. They also have jams that they make with their local berries. So a lot of their foods are things that they grow, or fish, or raise by themselves on the island. So it's not a lot of foods being imported on those islands. The majority, the biggest language spoken is English, because of course they're mostly British people. There are other languages spoken, like Spanish is the second biggest language spoken, because there's a lot of Chilean immigrants that go there. But with the English, there's a lot of dialects and accents, because they're so far from Britain. They started creating their own dialects. They actually have a lot of loan words they got from Spanish because of the Chilean immigrants. So that's pretty interesting. The dialects are said to be something similar to Australian, New Zealand, West Country, or Norfolk. And if you venture outside of Stanley, which is the main town on the islands, the accents get a lot stronger. So in Stanley, the accents sound more British, but if you go to the rural areas, they sound more like other types of English. They also really like their British heritage. Their currency is the Falkland Island pound, which keeps in spirit with the British pound. Their biggest export is actually wool. So their countryside is almost entirely dedicated to raising sheep so they can sell their wool. Their wool is mostly sold in Great Britain, but it's their biggest land export, and it really helps their economy. Their economy's actually been growing since the late 20th century. But along with wool, they also have sheep, lamb meat, and fish that help their economy. They also have tourism, especially ecotourism, which is they show people around the islands. They show them like some of the wildlife, like the birds. There actually aren't any more mammals, not native on their islands anymore, but they still have, like the fish. There's seals, penguins, all kinds of things to show their tourists. They also only have one bank, the Standard Chartered Bank, which is headquartered in London. So they don't really have many options when it comes to banking. But the islanders, they do receive free medical service at a hospital in Stanley, so their health care is actually pretty decent. They don't have to pay for that. The way their government works, so the biggest part of their government is the British Crown. That's the highest point. And the British Crown appoints a governor who oversees the territory. So then under the governor are the Executive Council, which consists of 3 elected members of the Legislative Assembly and then 2 ex officio members. Usually the governor will have to consult with the council before he or she does anything, although under certain circumstances he is allowed to act against the council. The Legislative Assembly consists of 10 members, 8 of whom are elected. The other 2 are non-voting ex officio members. Those are the same members that work under the governor. So the 8 who are elected, they're elected for 4-year terms. And unlike the United States, there's no political parties. So all the politicians, they're independent. They also have a constitution just like the United States. Their constitution was actually recently changed in 2009, so it gave them more power to be self-governing. Although if they wanted to do something with their defense or internal security, they still have to go through the commander of the British military. But other than that, they're mostly self-governing. They can sustain their own economy. And keeping up with their British cultures, you can see things like pubs and bright red mailboxes and a lot of well-kept gardens in their main town of Stanley. And like mentioned earlier, they are very fond of their tea time, which is something they get from their British heritage. They also do other activities like bird watching and fishing, of course, and horseback racing. And then they even have like an annual marathon that they run. They've had that since 2005. They're also a pretty big fan of their history because it's so interesting. And then the wildlife too, because the wildlife brings in a lot of money during their ecotourism when they show off all their wildlife to people. And that is Falkland Islands.